I told Ethan Miller about my pregnancy, but I never received a response from him. I thought he might be too busy to notice, so I decided to find him in person. However, I overheard him mentioning Lily Moore's pregnancy at his office door, and my heart sank. I remembered that she had lost a child before, and I didn't want my baby to be in her womb. So, I quietly left his company and went straight to the hospital. Later, I moved away and left him a letter, having truly experienced the pain of pregnancy this time. When I walked out of the hospital, I felt a sense of joy in my heart. I looked at the report in my hand. The numbers on it were a bit confusing to me, but they clearly indicated the fact that I was pregnant. A new life was growing inside me, a testament to the love between Ethan Miller and me. I carefully took a photo of the report and sent it to Ethan Miller. This was the child I had longed for, and I believed that Ethan Miller would be just as happy as I was when he found out. Thinking about the expression on his face when he saw the news made me unable to help but smile. We have always had a great relationship, and others see us as a model couple. This child will undoubtedly add color to our happy life and bring even more laughter and joy. After I sent the photo, I waited on the screen for a long time, but there was no reply. I didn't think much about it and put my phone away, preparing to head home. All the way, I wore a happy smile, thinking about how we should celebrate this memorable day. When I get home, Ethan Miller will surely be excited to pick me up. He might be a bit too vigorous when he's thrilled, so I need to remind him to be a little more gentle since we're about to become parents. However, when I got home and took out my phone, I noticed that he still hadn't replied, which left me a bit puzzled. Ethan Miller has always been very caring towards me. Although he doesn't always reply immediately, he usually doesn't make me wait too long. Even during meetings, he never puts his phone on silent because he fears missing my messages. I thought he might be busy with work and didn't have time to check his phone, so I didn't think much of it. However, I really wanted to share this good news with him quickly. I didn't want to delay such an important matter, so I decided to go tell him in person. Before heading out, I specifically reminded the aunt to make some extra dishes that Ethan Miller likes because we're going to have a good celebration tonight. Seeing me so happy, the aunt asked if something good had happened at home. I smiled mysteriously and said, "I'll tell you when Ethan Miller comes back." Once I arrived at the company, I took the elevator straight to the top floor and headed directly to Ethan Miller's office. Ethan Miller might be in an important meeting, so I decided to wait for him to return in the office. Ethan Miller's secretary saw me and asked with a smile, "Ma'am, are you here to see the president?" I nodded, and she stood up to inform him. I hurriedly said, "No need to, I can go myself." "Is Ethan Miller in a meeting?" The secretary looked a bit puzzled and replied, "The president is in his office." Although I felt somewhat confused about why Ethan Miller hadn't replied to my messages, I still maintained a calm expression. I said, "Okay, you carry on." "Thank you," and then headed towards his office. As I approached the office door, I heard Ethan Miller's voice inside, and I felt a stir of curiosity, preparing to push the door open. But when I heard him mention my name, my hand instinctively froze, and I began to wonder what he was going to say. Logically, I should have felt happy, but the thought that she had previously experienced a miscarriage made me reluctant to let my child have any connection to her. My mind suddenly went blank. I couldn't hear what he said next. All I could think about was his earlier statement, she had lost a child, and I didn't want my child to be connected to her. It turns out that he wasn't ignoring me, he just didn't want to respond. It turns out that he felt this way. It turns out that he wasn't happy about my pregnancy. It turns out that our feelings were completely different. Stumbling back, I turned around and walked away. My secretary noticed that something was off with me and asked concernedly what was wrong. I forced a smile at her, trying to hold on to the last bit of my sanity. "It's nothing," I suddenly remembered I have something to do at home. "I plan to wait for Ethan Miller there and don't want to bring this up with you and the president." The secretary nodded. "Oh, so you want to surprise the president. How ironic." I initially thought this would be a pleasant surprise, but now it seemed I was just being delusional. What I believed to be a surprise for Ethan Miller was, in fact, more of a burden to him. I don't remember how I left the building or how I got home. The housekeeper greeted me cheerfully, asking why I was back so soon. She was about to inquire if there was any good news, but upon seeing my pale face, she swallowed her words. "Madam, why do you look so pale? Are you not feeling well?" I weakly waved my hand and went upstairs alone. Ethan Miller and I have been together for 4 years, from dating to marriage and now expecting a baby. Throughout these 4 years, our relationship has been very good, and we rarely argue. Even when we have minor disagreements occasionally, he usually lets me have my way. His care for me is truly meticulous. He doesn't let me do anything. He washes every pair of his socks and every piece of underwear by hand for me. During the early stages of starting his business, he faced huge debts, yet he never made me feel that our quality of life diminished. He always says, "Lily Moore, you are my princess, and a princess must not suffer." My friends envy me for having a good boyfriend who is not only responsible and handsome but also loves me very much. I often feel the happiness and satisfaction in this relationship. When we had been together for almost 2 years, I decided to give myself to him. That day, he saw a scar on my belly, and I told him it was from a time when I had been pregnant before. In truth, I didn't want him to worry about me. At the beginning of our relationship, I mentioned that I had experienced bullying in school. He felt heartbroken for me and even shed tears. This scar was left from surgery after the injury, and I was afraid he would worry again. Besides, those events are in the past, so I didn't want to bring them up anymore. On the other hand, I also wanted to see his reaction. He gently caressed my scar and said with concern, "My dear, you've suffered. I will never let you go through such things again." At that moment, I felt very touched and happy. I knew I was right about him. Ethan Miller is someone I can trust. But now that I think back on it, that statement takes on a different meaning. It turns out that he didn't actually not care, rather, he hoped I wouldn't get pregnant and didn't want me to suffer anymore. Tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. I packed my things and returned to my family home. When my mom saw me come back alone, she couldn't help but ask, "Where is Ethan Miller? Why didn't you come back with him?" I felt exhausted and managed to force a smile as I said he had something to take care of at his company. My mom noticed my unwillingness at a glance and started to lecture me again. One thing she said almost made me cry. She sighed, pulled me down onto the sofa, held my hand, and said seriously, "Lily, it's not that I'm criticizing you. Ethan Miller is a good kid. I've seen how patient he has been with you all these years. You have been spoiled by me and tend to throw tantrums easily. Couples need to understand and tolerate each other. When problems arise, it's important to communicate and resolve them properly. Just going back to your parents' home when you're angry won't solve anything." I bit my lip, trying to control my trembling voice. This time it was truly different. I recounted the whole situation to my mother. After listening, she felt somewhat helpless. She knew I was struggling inside, but she also understood that trust between spouses is very important. Lying is not a choice worth admiring. If you choose to lie to Ethan Miller, you must bear the consequences. My mom wiped away my tears and then said that people often speak with emotions, sometimes sweetly and sometimes painfully. But actions cannot be deceived. Lily, what matters is not what he said, but what he did. My mom's words left me deep in thought. When I first heard Ethan Miller's words, I felt disappointed and pained. However, the feelings we have built over the years are not false. Those wonderful memories remain vivid. My mother noticed my turmoil and said, "You see, you also care about this child." She continued, "Deciding whether to have a child is a matter for both of you. You should communicate well with Ethan Miller and not make a hasty decision that you might regret. After all, the child is innocent. You must have eagerly anticipated his arrival back then, didn't you?" This sentence deeply moved me. In my interactions with Ethan Miller, he has always been very accommodating. I tend to be impatient and can sometimes get emotional and raise my voice, which my mom often criticizes me for. However, Ethan Miller never blames me. Instead, he gently says that as long as I'm happy, that's what matters. He believes that I'm just a bit impatient and that I'm actually a kind-hearted good child. I suddenly realized that I was being a bit willful. Perhaps I shouldn't lie about the scar on my belly. However, every time I think of those words, my heart aches. Loving someone is supposed to be unconditional, isn't it? Shouldn't the past really be an obstacle to our being together? At that moment, my phone rang. I looked down to see that it was Ethan Miller calling, probably having noticed I wasn't home after work. I hung up the phone expressionlessly. When the other person called again, I hung up once more. He continued to call, and this went on repeatedly for several times. Eventually, he gave up on calling and started sending me messages. "Honey, why aren't you at home? Where did you go? I've seen the photos you posted. At that time, I was in a meeting, and after work, I hurried home, but the aunt said that you had gone out. What did the doctor say? How is the child doing? You are currently going through a special period, so you need to take extra care. I will hire 2 more aunts to take good care of you. I looked at his messages one by one, but I no longer felt the sweetness I once had. This was the first time he lied to me. He hadn't really overlooked my messages, but was intentionally pretending not to see them. If I hadn't heard what he said in person, I might have genuinely believed he was looking forward to the arrival of this child. My mother was worried he would be concerned, so she couldn't help but secretly tell him that I was back. To prevent him from overthinking, she only mentioned that a few months ago the pregnancy had been unstable, and that she wanted to take care of me personally, assuring him that he could focus on his work and didn't need to come over. I think he is still concerned about that matter and is unable to find peace. For the sake of our child's future, as well as our own, Ethan Miller has sent over many supplements. He calls me every day, sending video calls and phone calls, and if I don't answer, he leaves voice messages, constantly reminding me to take care of my pregnancy. His voice is filled with worry and exhaustion. I can sense that my situation is unsettling him, even affecting his sleep. Perhaps my mom is right, no one is perfect. Although some of his words have been hard for me to let go of, his care and effort towards me are truly commendable. Maybe I should be a little more honest with him. I decided to give him a chance and to give myself a chance as well. When my mom accompanied me to the prenatal checkup, she kindly reminded me to communicate well with Ethan Miller. She said that it's normal for couples to have disagreements, but we shouldn't let trivial matters affect our relationship and future. Looking at the blurry image on the ultrasound report, my heart seemed to be filled, and some of my inner thoughts gradually became clearer. Just then, Ethan Miller called. I answered the phone, and his voice carried a hint of relief. Lily, you finally answered the phone. I've really been worried these days not being able to hear your voice. How have you been? Are you feeling okay? Have you been resting well? One question after another flowed from him, revealing his genuine concern for me. But I don't know why, I still felt a sense of emptiness inside. After hanging up the phone, my mom looked at me teasingly and said, "That was Ethan Miller, wasn't it?" She noticed me smile and added, "Ethan Miller is still worried about you." As my mom and I walked out of the hospital, before she could finish her sentence, we both froze. Ethan Miller was with a young girl, who was affectionately linking her arm through his, and the tenderness on his face was something I thought only appeared when he was with me. The man who had just spoken to me on the phone, expressing his longing and concern for me, now appeared before me with a girl I didn't recognize by his side. Right here, in the obstetrics and gynecology department. When Ethan Miller saw me, he immediately pulled his hand away from the girl, but this only made the atmosphere more awkward. The girl was completely oblivious to the situation, snuggling back into Ethan Miller's arm, pouting, "Ethan, what are you doing? You almost hurt me." But at that moment, Ethan Miller was far too anxious to comfort her. He looked at me with a frantic expression. He knew that everything was over. I understood it too. I thought I should get angry, that I should break down and demand to know who that girl was and what their relationship was. But I didn't react. I just quietly watched their hands clasped together, feeling an involuntary smile tug at my lips. Suddenly, I felt as if something inside me had fallen away, and surprisingly, it brought me a sense of relief. Ethan Miller was taken aback by my smile. He coldly released the girl's hand and hurried over to hug me. I took a step back, and his movements came to a sudden halt, unsure of how to proceed. It seemed he wanted to explain, but in that moment, all explanations felt inadequate. I tightly held my mother's hand and said with all my strength, "Let's talk about it when we get home." I didn't want to have a big argument with Ethan Miller, whom I had loved for 4 years, in such an inappropriate setting. The girl beside Ethan Miller also realized the situation and quietly said to him, "Brother Ethan Miller, I'll wait for you at home." I suddenly felt like laughing. Home? They had a home too. So what were we? Ethan Miller didn't respond. He simply frowned and stared at me, and I remained silent, not even wanting to give him a glance. He followed me all the way to the villa. My mom knew we needed some private space, so she gently reminded me to speak calmly and not to get angry, before stepping out of the room and closing the door behind her. The moment the door closed, Ethan Miller knelt down in front of me. Tears streamed down my face in an instant. I remembered our first fight happening on our 2nd anniversary. That day, I was filled with anticipation, looking forward to celebrating with him, but he forgot about the occasion because he was too caught up in work. In the end, I waited alone in the living room for a long time until it was just before dawn. As the night grew cooler, he finally returned home, carrying the smell of smoke. I'm not an unreasonable person. If he was genuinely busy with work, I would have understood and supported him as long as he had informed me. He had clearly promised to spend our anniversary with me, yet after I had put so much effort into preparing for it, he completely overlooked it. He didn't respond to my messages or calls, which turned my anticipation into disappointment and then into despair. This led to our first, and most intense, argument. Looking back now, everything actually happened for a reason. That argument took place shortly after he discovered that scar. It turned out that from that moment on, this incident had planted a thorn in his heart. As a result of the argument, he took the initiative to reconcile with me, but I did not agree. In the end, he knelt in front of me, tears streaming down silently, and my heart softened immediately. After a while, our relationship was even better than before. This was the second time he knelt down in front of me, and I felt an indescribable ache and sense of grievance in my heart. My emotions were complicated and conflicting, making it difficult for me to come to terms with it. He loved me so much, we had spent countless days and nights together. His phone and computer passwords were both my birthday, and he was completely open with me. Could he really have the time to develop feelings for another woman? We used to be a couple that everyone envied, and no one, including myself, doubted his love for me. I have imagined many scenarios of a possible breakup, yet I have never doubted his loyalty. But what I didn't expect was that the person everyone believed would never betray me did something completely unexpected. I trembled as I asked him when it all began. He knelt before me, clutching my legs tightly, his tears soaking my clothes as he apologized, saying, "I'm so sorry, my dear wife, I really am. I know that no matter what I say or do, I can't make it up to you. I only ask for one chance, promising that this will never happen again." Ethan Miller, why do people change their hearts? I once asked him why it was so difficult to remain consistent. He gently stroked my hair and said he didn't know about others, but I would always have a place in his heart. He truly cared for me, but I was not the only one. His first time with that person happened to be on our second anniversary. I went from being filled with anticipation to feeling disappointed. I waited all night for him to come home, only to find out he was with another woman, sharing the intimacy that used to belong solely to us. No wonder he acted so strangely when he returned. He got angry over just a few of my words. Later, he knelt down and cried as he apologized to me, seemingly wanting to make amends out of guilt. When someone has something weighing on their mind, they often behave differently than before. How did I fail to notice that at the time? Was it because he loved me too much, or was his acting just too convincing? Was it my excessive trust in him, or was I simply too naive? They were entangled for a whole 2 years, yet I never noticed any signs. I asked him how they met, and he replied that she was an employee under him. I then asked, "Where do you usually meet?" He answered, "In my lounge." Suddenly, I felt a wave of nausea, and my body began to retch, but nothing came up. Ethan Miller's lounge. There was a time when I constantly worried about his eating habits and brought him meals. We often had lunch together here. He would smile innocently and say, "My wife treats me so well, I can't live without you for the rest of my life." We had also fallen asleep in the lounge, embracing each other and sharing intimate moments. However, in the sweet memories that once filled me, there is always the shadow of another woman. They have been in the same places and done the same things. Tears filled my eyes, but I still couldn't express anything. He hurriedly reached out to wipe my tears, asking if we could stop discussing this topic. I pushed his hand away and asked one last question. "She's pregnant, isn't she?" He silently cried, quietly confirming my foolish question. I tried to pry open his hands that were tightly holding me, but no matter how I struggled, he refused to let go, and eventually, I couldn't help but cry. "I beg you, Lily, give me a chance to make things right. You don't have to forgive me right away. You can observe and test me. I promise that this will never happen again. Please don't leave me, okay?" I will have her terminate the pregnancy right away and ensure there will be no further contact. As long as we have our own children, that's enough. If there really were a way to go back in time, would Ethan Miller choose to come back to that meeting? I believe the answer is no. Even if it weren't her, someone else would have shown up. Whether it was impulsiveness or emotions, the ultimate cause of the rift between us was that non-existent child. This rift grew larger and eventually turned into an insurmountable chasm, which is the reason for the current situation. My lies came at a cost. It's only natural for him to care about it. He could have honestly told me how he felt, instead of punishing my moment of impulse through betrayal. In the end, I chose to get a divorce, which Ethan Miller of course disagreed with. He desperately tried to keep me from going through with it, and ultimately, I had to call my mother-in-law. After understanding the situation, my mother-in-law sternly criticized Ethan Miller and told him to stop harassing me. She held my hand and said with concern, "Lily, you are a good girl. It's Ethan Miller who is confused. I understand that you need time to think things over, so there's no need to rush. Whatever decision you make, I have already regarded you as my own daughter. I am very fortunate to have such an understanding mother-in-law. She has never cared about my background as a single parent and has always treated me sincerely over the years." In the end, Ethan Miller suddenly relented and agreed to the divorce. Although I refused, he still forcefully transferred 20% of the company's shares to me, claiming it was for the child's support. In fact, he didn't know that I had already decided not to keep the child. Our relationship had long been in trouble. My desire not to have this child was not only due to his infidelity. I had previously stated that I didn't want my child to be born without blessings. My father passed away when I was 5, and my mother raised me on her own. Although I have never witnessed a harmonious relationship between my parents, every time my mom mentions my dad, a happy smile always appears on her face. She often tells me stories about her and my dad when they were young, as well as the joyful moments we shared as a family of 3. Therefore, even though I live in a single-parent household, I do not feel lonely. Besides having a mom who loves me very much, I also know that my dad loves me too. I originally thought my mom would oppose my decision, thinking I was being impulsive and irrational, but instead, she gently ran her fingers through my hair and said, "Lily, go do what you feel is right." On the day of the surgery, my mom accompanied me, her eyes filled with worry. At the hospital, I unexpectedly met someone, the girl who was with Ethan Miller that day. She could be considered the third party in our relationship. My mother-in-law later mentioned her, calling her Emily Smith. She's only 22 years old and still an intern. After the incident, my mother-in-law immediately found a reason to dismiss her. When mentioning her, my mother-in-law displayed a look of disdain, as if she held her in contempt. She felt that this young girl was unambitious and only sought shortcuts. My mother-in-law firmly stated that she would never allow such a girl to enter our lives. I pretended not to understand her insinuation, but I was deeply grateful for my mother-in-law's concern. Emily Smith recognized me. At first, her eyes widened in surprise, and then she appeared a bit timid and vulnerable, softly calling me Sister Lily. Seeing her like this, I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. In order to please others, she pretends to be someone completely different, living every day with a mask on. Doesn't she feel exhausted? I didn't want to get entangled with her and planned to leave. As I passed by her, she leaned in and asked, "Sister Lily, are you here for a checkup too?" It seemed she was eager to elevate her status, impatient to reveal something in front of me. I raised an eyebrow and glanced at her, replying, "You should be more concerned about Ethan Miller and his mother, so don't waste your time here with me." My words undoubtedly struck a nerve. Ethan Miller's mother had always had a strong dislike for certain people, and it was clear that Emily Smith was not welcome in her eyes. The facade of gentleness that Emily had been wearing instantly disappeared, replaced by a gaze filled with resentment and anger, her lips pressed tightly together. Seemingly pleased with herself, she declared, "I'm already pregnant, and Ethan Miller will soon take me home as his wife. You'll soon be replaced." To be honest, I didn't expect her to be so emotional, nor did I anticipate her reaction would be so strong. What she said struck me as both ridiculous and sad. Can she really get what she wants? If Ethan Miller truly loves her, how could he let her go for a prenatal checkup by herself? My former mother-in-law was also difficult to deal with. I smiled gently, not wanting to shatter her dreams, and said, "I hope you get your wish." After that, I took my mother's hand and left the hospital. Suddenly, I remembered when I was preparing for my own wedding, I also believed that I would surely find happiness, but looking back now, it seems quite ironic. After completing the divorce procedures, I chose to go on a trip with my mother to relax, and also to escape this place filled with strife. Before leaving, I left a letter for Ethan Miller. "Ethan Miller, this is Lily. First of all, congratulations to both of us for regaining our freedom. I wonder if you feel sad or regretful. You were someone I truly loved, and the moment I learned of your betrayal, my heart nearly broke. I never imagined that someone close to me would deceive me, let alone you. I believe you once loved me sincerely, and your care for me is something I will always cherish. Do you really think that the only issue between us is Emily Smith? That's not true at all. Ethan Miller, what was the reason you two got together in the first place? Ultimately, what is it that you truly care about? Have you suddenly come to realize something? I remember the day I found out I was pregnant, you said something in the office. Do you remember? Maybe you didn't expect it, and honestly, I didn't either. It's just a coincidence that I happened to hear it. I also have a responsibility in this, Ethan Miller. I lied to you. That scar on my belly is from a surgery I had after an injury when I was a child. I didn't tell you the truth because I was worried it would cause you concern, but the reality is that there's nothing else to it. You said at the time that you didn't mind, and I truly believed you, so I didn't think about it any further. I never expected things to become so complicated. It really has been one mistake after another. I don't know whether I overestimated our relationship or underestimated your expectations of me. But it's okay, the most important thing is to cut my losses in time. This time, I truly experienced the pain of losing a child. It would be a lie to say that I'm not sad, but I have no regrets. If I encounter new feelings in the future, I will be honest about it. My past love was genuine, and there is nothing to be ashamed of. There is also nothing shameful about giving everything for the person you love. If my partner feels uncomfortable with that, it only shows that we are not meant for each other. I am willing to bear the consequences of my choices. As for Ethan Miller, I must admit that I am a bit selfish and do not wish him well. Later, I learned that Emily Smith also lost her child unexpectedly, for reasons unknown, and that child was not a blessing either. She ultimately did not get to marry Ethan Miller, and I heard she faced a ban in the industry, suffering setbacks in both love and career. However, none of this is really my concern anymore. My mother and I went to a coastal city in the south and stayed there for a long time. Along with that letter, there was the child support payment that Ethan Miller had sent me earlier. Now that the child is gone, the child support no longer holds any meaning. In fact, over the years, with Ethan Miller's help, my own studio has been thriving, allowing my mother and me to live a comfortable and free life. Therefore, I don't need to accept his shares, and I have no desire to have any further involvement with him. If it weren't for that incident, he would truly be a perfect boyfriend without any flaws. After my mother-in-law got divorced, I started calling her Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson often messages me, and she was really angry when she found out I returned the shares. She believes I shouldn't have made sacrifices for him and thinks women should retain some assets and live their own lives well. Occasionally, Mrs. Johnson asks me about my feelings or brings up Ethan Miller. I know she hopes we can get back together, but she has treated me sincerely well. So even though I don't plan on reconciling, I still keep in touch with her. When we returned from our trip, it was Mrs. Johnson who came to pick us up. I didn't tell her our flight information, and I don't know how she found out. When she saw us, she immediately pulled us into the car. In the end, although my mom and I felt a bit awkward, we agreed to the dinner that Mrs. Johnson had arranged. The restaurant was decorated in a Chinese style, and it was a place that Ethan Miller and I used to visit often. I suddenly felt a pang of anxiety. Sure enough, just after the dishes were served, the door was pushed open, and Ethan Miller appeared at the entrance in a suit, looking somewhat anxious. Mrs. Johnson awkwardly smiled, indicating that she hadn't called for the child, and she was puzzled about how he knew to come. My mother's expression clearly showed her displeasure, so I quickly took her hand and gave her a look to signal that she shouldn't take it to heart. Some things are ultimately unavoidable. The atmosphere at the dinner table was a bit awkward. Despite Mrs. Johnson's efforts to lighten things up, my mom clearly had no interest, especially when she glanced at Ethan Miller's face. She seemed ready to leave at any moment. Ethan Miller also felt the chill in the air. He sat silently between me and Mrs. Johnson, hardly eating anything, just quietly serving me dishes. However, I didn't touch any of the food he offered. The only reason I was able to remain polite and sit there was out of respect for Mrs. Johnson. I probably won't accept any more invitations to Mrs. Johnson's house in the future. In the atmosphere where everyone had their own thoughts, dinner finally came to an end, and the food was not very good. I accompanied my mom to the restroom, and when we came out, I happened to overhear Mrs. Johnson talking to Ethan Miller. She said it was really humiliating to have to invite Lily and her mother-in-law today, and she guessed that Lily wouldn't pay any attention to me in the future. She really couldn't understand the necessity of doing that. Ethan Miller's voice came through in a deep tone. "Mom, I just can't accept it." My mom calmly responded, "What good does it do to feel this way? If I had known today would turn out like this, I shouldn't have acted that way back then." She said this was the last time and told Ethan Miller not to even think about having her do such disgraceful things for him anymore. Then, I heard the footsteps of Mrs. Johnson gradually fading away. At that moment, my mom also came out of the bathroom. I grabbed her and gestured with my eyes for her to look outside. She spotted Ethan Miller by the door, and she was so angry that she wanted to rush out, thinking to herself, "How dare he come here? This is so annoying." I quickly pulled her back and said, "Mom, don't worry. I'll go talk to him." My mother glanced at me, sighed, and replied, "All right, it would be great if he can listen, but if he doesn't, then forget it. You shouldn't have any further dealings with that family." I nodded, agreeing with her thoughts. My mother walked ahead, leaving some space for Ethan Miller and me. Before leaving, she shot a glare at Ethan Miller, who responded with a polite smile. When he saw me, his face lit up with joy, and his eyes sparkled with anticipation. A complex emotion welled up inside me. "Lily," he approached me wanting to hold my hand, but I stepped aside to avoid him. "If there's something to say, just say it directly. There's no need for such intimacy. It's best to address everything in one go." He seemed to understand my meaning, and the expression on his face turned pained. "Lily, you still don't want to forgive me, do you?" I shook my head. I no longer cared about these things. What's in the past should stay in the past. Emily Smith was like this, and so was our marriage, as were you. He looked dissatisfied, having failed to keep her child and not having contacted her again. He asked me to give him another chance, wanting to make amends. I smiled and told him that I was doing well now, and the best compensation would be if he didn't disturb me. He seemed unable to believe that I could be so resolute, staring at me for a long time in disbelief. I sighed and couldn't help but urge him, "Ethan Miller, I no longer hold any grudges against you. We once loved each other deeply, so when I discovered your betrayal, I only felt pain, not hatred. No matter what the future holds, the effort we've both put in during the first 2 years together is enough. I don't like looking back, and I hope you feel the same way." His voice was choked with emotion. "If you can't do it, then try your best until you can. You're not only troubling yourself but also affecting Mrs. Johnson. She has invested a lot of effort into you, and you know that deep down. Ethan Miller, I want to tell you that the past is the past. There's nothing that can change it now. In the future, I might have new feelings and a new marriage, but that person will not be you. I no longer love you." He ultimately couldn't help but shed tears. "So, will we still be friends?" I pressed my lips together and replied that we could only be strangers. After saying that, I didn't wait for his reaction and walked straight out of the restaurant. My mother was still waiting for me to come home. After that meal, I deliberately tried to distance myself from Mrs. Johnson. We never really got along well, and although I still held some fondness for the past, I always regarded her as an elder. After all, she and Ethan Miller were family. Ethan was fully dedicated to his work, and now everyone said he had become a workaholic, which was quite impressive. As for whether he took in what was said that day, I wasn't very concerned about it. He returned the 20% share, and I no longer felt conflicted. I accepted it. After all, who would complain about having too much money? As for me, with my country's scenic beauty, my mom and I decided to go out and explore a bit more. The future is still bright.